Good evening, and welcome to another gentle journey through the quieter corners of history. Tonight, I invite you to settle in, find a comfortable position, and allow your body to relax as we travel back in time to explore one of humanity's most remarkable achievements, the ancient Silk Road. As you listen, feel free to close your eyes and let your imagination wander along dusty paths that connected east and west for over 2,000 years. The Silk Road was never a single road at all, but rather a vast network of routes, like rivers and their tributaries, flowing across mountains, deserts, steppes, and seas. Tonight, we'll trace these pathways slowly, thoughtfully, stopping to rest at the same caravanserais where weary travelers once found shelter. We'll examine the precious goods they carried, the customs they shared, and the quiet, daily rhythms of life that unfolded along these ancient highways of commerce and culture. So take a deep breath, exhale slowly, and let your mind drift eastward as we begin our journey along the Silk Road, one unhurried step at a time. The story of the Silk Road begins not with a grand declaration or a decisive battle, but with the quiet persistence of human curiosity and the gentle pull of distant markets. Long before it had a name, the pathways that would become the Silk Road were being traced by solitary travelers, local traders, and nomadic peoples moving seasonally across the landscapes of Central Asia. In the 2nd century BCE, during the Han Dynasty in China, an imperial envoy named Zhang Qian was sent westward on a diplomatic mission. His journey, lasting over a decade, took him through territories unknown to the Chinese court, across formidable mountain ranges, and into Central Asian kingdoms where he observed unfamiliar customs, languages, and goods. Upon his return to China, Zhang Qian brought back not only diplomatic information, but also knowledge of Western lands and their unusual products. The emperor was particularly intrigued by reports of the heavenly horses of Fergana, tall, powerful steeds unlike the smaller horses of China. These horses, Zhang Qian explained in his unhurried reports to the court, could potentially strengthen Chinese cavalry against northern nomadic threats. And so, with quiet deliberation rather than dramatic proclamation, the Chinese began to look westward with interest. Meanwhile, far to the west, the expanding Roman Empire was developing a taste for exotic goods. Roman women of means draped themselves in delicate silk fabrics that seemed to shimmer like water and catch the light like no textile they had ever seen. This fabric was so fine that one could pass an entire dress through a finger ring. The Romans knew this precious material came from somewhere in the distant east, from a land they called Serica, the land of silk. Between these two great civilizations stretched vast territories, the towering Pamir Mountains, the endless Taklamakan Desert, the windswept steppes of Central Asia, inhabited by diverse peoples with their own cultures, kingdoms, and trading traditions. It was through these intermediary lands that goods would gradually pass, hand to hand, trader to trader, in a great chain of exchange that would eventually span over 4,000 miles. Unlike modern trade routes planned by governments and corporations, the Silk Road emerged organically, like a river finding its natural course through the landscape. Traders simply sought the paths of least resistance. Mountain passes that weren't too treacherous, desert routes that passed by reliable water sources, and territories where local rulers offered some measure of safety in exchange for tolls or taxes. In the valleys of Central Asia, local farmers noticed that foreign merchants would pass through seasonally, seeking food and shelter. Gradually, these farmers began to set aside extra provisions, perhaps build an additional room onto their homes, or offer space in their stables for merchants' animals. These humble beginnings, a spare room, a shared meal, a safe place to rest, would eventually evolve into the caravanserais that became the backbone of Silk Road travel. The goods that moved along these early routes were valuable, but limited in quantity. From the east came not only silk, but also paper, gunpowder, and porcelain. From the west moved glassware, gold, silver, and wool. From the steppes came horses, jade, and furs. From the south came spices, cotton, and precious stones. Each item passed through many hands before reaching its final destination, and at each exchange, its value increased. But equally important to the material goods were the intangible exchanges, ideas, technologies, stories, and beliefs that traveled alongside the merchants. Buddhism spread eastward from India, while technologies like papermaking moved westward from China. Artistic styles blended and evolved as craftspeople encountered new motifs and techniques from distant lands. All of this occurred not in a rush of dramatic change, but through countless small interactions. A curious question asked over a shared evening meal, a demonstration of an unfamiliar tool, the careful explanation of a new technique for working metal or firing pottery. The Silk Road transformed the world not through conquest or revolution, but through conversation and connection, one traveler at a time. Let us now turn our attention to the daily experiences of those who traveled the Silk Road. Imagine yourself as a merchant setting out from Chang'an, the great capital of Tang Dynasty China, in the early 8th century CE. The Silk Road has been established for nearly a millennium by this time, and certain patterns and customs have developed to make the journey more predictable, if not always comfortable. Your preparation begins months before departure. You carefully select your goods, perhaps bolts of fine silk, packets of tea leaves, delicate porcelain vessels wrapped in straw, or bundles of fragrant spices. Each item must be valuable enough to justify its transport across thousands of miles, yet durable enough to survive the journey. You calculate the space each will occupy, the weight your animals can bear, and the likely profit at various points along the route. You would rarely travel alone. Instead, you join a caravan, a group of merchants who band together for safety and companionship. The size of these caravans varied greatly, from perhaps a dozen travelers with their animals to several hundred people moving together across the landscape. The larger caravans might include not only merchants but also religious pilgrims, diplomatic envoys, craftspeople seeking work in distant cities, or scholars in search of knowledge. The choice of pack animals was crucial and varied depending on the terrain. Camels were preferred for desert crossings, as they could go for days without water and carry heavy loads, up to 400 pounds per animal. The Bactrian camel, with its two humps, was particularly suited to the cold mountain regions, while the single-hump dromedary was better adapted to hotter deserts. In mountainous regions, sure-footed mules might be preferred, while horses were used where speed was more important than cargo capacity. Loading the animals was an art form in itself. The goods needed to be balanced precisely on either side of the animal, secured in such a way that they wouldn't shift during travel but could be quickly removed in case the animal stumbled or needed to be unburdened. Merchants developed specialized containers, wooden chests, woven baskets, leather pouches, each designed for particular types of goods and methods of transport. The rhythm of caravan life was slow and methodical. You would rise before dawn when the air was still cool. After a simple breakfast, perhaps flatbread, dried fruit, and tea, you would load your animals, a process that might take several hours for a large caravan. Travel would begin in the early morning and continue until the heat of midday, when the caravan would stop for several hours of rest. During these midday pauses, travelers would seek whatever shade was available, a cluster of trees, a rocky overhang, or simply the shadow cast by their animals and goods. They might nap, prepare a light meal, check their animals for signs of injury or exhaustion, or make minor repairs to harnesses, containers, or clothing. Conversation would flow quietly among the travelers. News and stories exchanged, advice shared about the route ahead. Travel would resume in the late afternoon and continue until dusk. The daily distance covered might be only 15 to 30 miles, a pace that seems remarkably slow by modern standards, but was sustainable for both humans and animals over the months-long journey. The caravan leaders would plan each day's travel carefully, aiming to reach water sources or establish stopping places by nightfall. The evening routine involved unloading the animals, setting up camp, preparing the main meal of the day, and tending to any necessary repairs or maintenance. Merchants would gather in small groups, sharing food and conversation. Perhaps someone would play a simple instrument, a flute or string instrument, or recite poetry or tales from their homeland. On clear nights, The stars would provide both entertainment and navigation guidance for the journey ahead. Sleep came easily after a day of physical exertion, though merchants typically took turns keeping watch through the night. The dangers of the road were real, not only bandits in some regions, but also unpredictable weather, wild animals, or simply the risk that animals might wander off in search of better grazing. This pattern would repeat day after day, with variations depending on the terrain and season. Desert crossings required careful water management and travel time to avoid the most punishing heat. Mountain passes could only be traversed during certain months when they weren't blocked by snow. Some sections might be traveled at night to avoid daytime heat, while others required daylight to navigate safely. The social dynamics within caravans were fascinating and complex. Leadership typically fell to experienced merchants who knew the routes well, though formal hierarchies were often loose. Decision-making tended to be collaborative, with the group considering factors like weather conditions, reports of potential dangers ahead, or the health of their animals. Languages and communication presented both challenges and opportunities. Successful Silk Road merchants often spoke several languages, at least enough to conduct basic transactions. A merchant from Samarkand might know some Chinese, Persian, and Turkic languages, allowing them to communicate across a wide geographic range. In regions where no common language existed, a simplified trade language often developed. A limited vocabulary focused on numbers, goods, and basic needs that allowed commerce to proceed. Many merchants specialized in particular segments of the route rather than traveling its entire length. A trader from Bokhara might regularly travel the section between their home city and Kashgar, becoming intimately familiar with that specific landscape, its challenges, and opportunities. They would sell their goods in Kashgar to another merchant who specialized in the route eastward to Dunhuang, and so on. This specialization allowed merchants to develop deep local knowledge and relationships. The composition of goods often changed along the journey as merchants responded to market opportunities. A trader setting out from Chang'an with silk might sell some in Dunhuang, using the proceeds to purchase jade that was in demand further west. In Kashgar, they might trade some of their remaining silk for locally produced carpets that would fetch a good price in Samarkand. This constant recalibration of inventory allowed merchants to maximize profits while maintaining a diverse and adaptable stock of goods. For many travelers, the Silk Road journey was not just about commerce, but also about personal growth and discovery. Buddhist monks traveled from China to India seeking original texts and teachings. Artists encountered new styles and techniques that they incorporated into their work. Astronomers compared observations and calculations with colleagues from distant lands. The Silk Road was as much a conduit for knowledge and wisdom as it was for silk and spices. As we imagine ourselves traveling with this caravan, we might be struck by the patience required, a patience almost foreign to our modern sensibilities. The journey from Chang'an to Baghdad might take a year or more. News traveled at the same unhurried pace as the caravans themselves. A merchant might leave home not knowing if they would return in 1 year or 3, or indeed if they would return at all. This acceptance of time's slow passage, this surrender to the rhythm of seasons and the limitations of physical travel, shaped the mindset of Silk Road travelers in profound ways. Perhaps the most distinctive architectural feature of the Silk Road was the caravanserai, a type of inn specifically designed to shelter travelers and their animals. The word comes from Persian, combining caravan, a group of travelers, with sarai, a palace or building. These structures emerged as a response to the specific needs of long-distance trade and eventually formed a network of hospitality that stretched from China to the Mediterranean. The typical caravanserai was designed with both practicality and safety in mind. From the outside, it often resembled a fortress, a square or rectangular structure with high walls of mud brick, stone, or fired brick, depending on local materials. These walls stood as a barrier against bandits, wild animals, and harsh weather. A single fortified gate, large enough to admit laden camels, provided the only entrance and could be closed and barred at night. Inside, the caravanserai opened onto a central courtyard where animals could be unloaded and goods organized. Around this courtyard ran a platform or series of rooms where travelers could rest, protected from the elements. Some caravanserais were quite basic, offering little more than shelter, while others were more elaborate, with designated areas for prayer, bathing, cooking, and storage. The larger ones might include shops, barbers, food vendors, blacksmiths for repairing metal goods, and even entertainment. The spacing of caravanserais along trade routes was not random, but carefully calculated based on typical daily travel distances. In ideal conditions, a traveler would find a caravanserai every 30 to 40 kilometers, a comfortable day's journey. In particularly challenging terrain, they might be closer together, while in some remote regions, travelers might need to camp in the open for several nights between facilities. The administration of caravanserais varied across regions and time periods. Some were built and maintained by governments who recognized the economic benefits of facilitating trade. The Byzantine Empire, the Seljuk Turks, and the Safavid Persian Empire all invested significantly in caravanserai networks. Other caravanserais were established through religious endowments as acts of charity and piety. Islam, in particular, encouraged the building of facilities to aid travelers as a form of zakat, charitable giving. Many caravanserais operated on a fascinating economic model. They provided basic shelter free of charge to travelers while generating income through services and supplies. A merchant might pay nothing to sleep within the caravanserai walls, but would purchase fodder for their animals, food for themselves, bathhouse access, or storage services. This system ensured that even merchants of modest means could find safe shelter, while those with greater resources could purchase additional comforts. Let us imagine arriving at a caravanserai after a long day's journey. The sun is low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty landscape. You see the square structure ahead, its walls glowing amber in the evening light. As you approach, other travelers are also converging on this haven, perhaps a group of silk merchants from Sogdia, a few Buddhist pilgrims from China, or a small delegation of officials from a local kingdom. The large wooden gates stand open during daylight hours. You guide your animals through the entrance, passing under the shadowed archway and emerging into the courtyard where the day's last sunlight still reaches. The caravanserai keeper or his assistants might greet regular travelers by name, while welcoming newcomers with practiced hospitality. The unloading of animals and securing of goods comes first, a well-choreographed process after months on the road. Camels kneel to have their burdens removed. Pack horses are led to designated areas. Goods are arranged in orderly piles or carried directly to assigned rooms or storage areas. The animals are led to troughs for water and stalls or enclosures where they'll receive fodder and rest. Only after the animals and goods are secured do you attend to your own comfort. You might claim a small room off the courtyard if the caravanserai offers private spaces, or simply establish your place along the common platform. Regular travelers often had preferred spots in particular caravanserais, perhaps a corner that caught the evening breeze or stayed warmer on cold nights. The evening meal at a caravanserai could be a simple affair of provisions carried by the travelers themselves, or it might be quite elaborate at larger establishments. Some caravanserais employed cooks who prepared regional specialties, while others had arrangements with local vendors who would arrive each evening with prepared foods for sale. The courtyard might fill with the aroma of baking bread, simmering stews, or roasting meats, along with the sound of quiet conversation in multiple languages. Water was perhaps the most precious commodity at these desert and steppe outposts. Many caravanserais were specifically located near natural springs or wells, while others relied on elaborate water catchment systems or cisterns filled during rainy seasons. The availability of clean water for both humans and animals was often what determined a caravanserai's success and longevity. After the evening meal, travelers might gather in small groups. Those who shared a common language would exchange news from their homelands or discuss conditions along the route ahead. Merchants might conduct business, arranging to buy, sell, or trade goods with others in the caravanserai. Some facilities included dedicated spaces for prayer, allowing travelers to maintain their religious practices while far from home. Information was a valuable currency in these gatherings. A merchant just arriving from the east might share reports about political conditions in Chang'an, unusual weather in the Taklamakan Desert, or new toll being collected at a particular mountain pass. Those traveling westward would offer similar intelligence about conditions in Samarkand, Baghdad, or Constantinople. This informal intelligence network helped travelers prepare for challenges ahead and adjust their routes or trading strategies accordingly. Sleep came early in most caravanserais, as travelers typically rose before dawn. The gates would be closed and barred at sunset, reopening only at first light. During the night, watchmen might patrol the walls, though the greatest threat to peaceful sleep was often not bandits, but the sounds of restless animals or snoring fellow travelers. The social atmosphere within caravanserais was governed by unwritten but widely understood codes of conduct. These were spaces where people of different religions, ethnicities, and social standings coexisted temporarily, and certain accommodations were made to ensure harmony. Religious dietary restrictions were respected, with separate cooking areas sometimes designated for different groups. Privacy was granted as much as the facilities allowed, particularly for women travelers, who were less common but certainly present on the Silk Road. The caravanserai network served functions beyond mere lodging. They became natural marketplaces where goods could change hands without the need to transport them further. A merchant from Bokhara might meet a buyer from Nishapur at a caravanserai in Merv, conduct their transaction there, and each return to their home city rather than continuing the journey. This efficient arrangement reduced the physical movement of goods while still enabling long-distance trade. They also functioned as communication hubs in an era before formal postal systems. Merchants would carry letters or verbal messages for others, delivering them to recipients they encountered at caravanserais or passing them to other travelers heading in the appropriate direction. News, both personal and political, spread along the Silk Road through these informal networks, eventually traveling its entire length through countless person-to-person exchanges. The caravanserai system reached its zenith during the 10th to 13th centuries, when political stability in key regions allowed for significant investment in infrastructure. The Seljuk Turks were particularly prolific builders, constructing hundreds of caravanserais across Anatolia and Persia, many of which survive today. These later caravanserais were often architecturally sophisticated, with elegant decoration, efficient heating systems, and specialized facilities like hammams, bathhouses. As we lie here imagining these ancient havens, we might reflect on how the caravanserai embodied a particular philosophy of hospitality, one that recognized the universal human needs for shelter, security, and community, especially in inhospitable landscapes. They represent a remarkably humane response to the challenges of long-distance travel, a system that acknowledged our shared vulnerability to the elements and our common desire for safe passage through uncertain territories. While Silk gave the road its name, thanks to a 19th-century German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, who coined the term Seidenstrasse, or Silk Road, the diversity of goods that traveled these ancient pathways was remarkable. Let us explore these treasures, not with the haste of a museum tour, but with the patience of a merchant who understands the story behind each item. Silk itself deserves our first attention. The production of this lustrous fabric was a closely guarded secret in China for nearly 3,000 years. Legend attributes its discovery to Lady Shiling Shi, wife of the Yellow Emperor, around 2700 BCE. She supposedly observed silkworms spinning cocoons and developed a method to unravel the threads and weave them into fabric. The process was labor-intensive and required specialized knowledge. Silkworm eggs were carefully incubated, and the hatched larvae were fed mulberry leaves for about a month until they began spinning their cocoons. These cocoons were then harvested before the moth could emerge, which would break the continuous thread, and placed in hot water to loosen the fibers. Workers would find the end of the thread and carefully unwind it. A single cocoon could yield a thread up to 1,000 meters long, though incredibly fine. These threads were then combined to create stronger strands and dyed using plant-based colorants before being woven into fabric. Different regions of China specialized in particular weaving techniques and patterns, creating distinct varieties of silk that knowledgeable merchants could identify by touch and appearance. The Chinese imperial court strictly controlled silk production and export, understanding its value as both a luxury good and a diplomatic tool. Silk was used to pay government officials and reward loyal subjects. In times of peace, it was presented as gifts to neighboring rulers to maintain friendly relations. The Chinese even used silk as a form of currency for international transactions. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 206 BC, 220 CE, silk had become China's most valuable export. Roman elites developed such a passion for the fabric that it caused economic concerns, with Roman senators complaining about the drain of gold to eastern lands in exchange for what they considered an unnecessary luxury. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder lamented that at least 100 million sesterces annually were being sent to China and other eastern regions for silk and other luxury goods. But silk was far from the only commodity that moved along these routes. From China also came paper, an invention traditionally attributed to Kai Luan in 105 CE, though archaeological evidence suggests earlier origins. The technology for papermaking spread gradually westward, reaching Samarkand by the 8th century and Baghdad by the 9th century, transforming communication and record-keeping throughout Eurasia. Porcelain was another distinctly Chinese product highly valued abroad. This hard, translucent ceramic was produced by firing kaolin clay at extremely high temperatures, a technique that other cultures could not replicate until much later. Chinese potters created vessels of extraordinary delicacy and beauty, often decorated with blue cobalt pigment imported from Persia, a lovely example of how goods moving in one direction along the Silk Road could influence the production of goods traveling in the opposite direction. Tea became increasingly important as a trade good during the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE. Initially valued for medicinal properties, it gradually became a beloved beverage across Asia. The distinctive tea bricks, compressed blocks of tea leaves that were easy to transport and could be broken off and steeped as needed, became a common sight in caravan loads heading westward. From the western end of the Silk Road came equally precious commodities. Glassware from Syria and Egypt was highly prized in China, where glass-blowing technology was unknown. These delicate vessels required especially careful packing for the long journey eastward. Nestled in straw or wool and often carried by hand rather than loaded onto animals for particularly valuable pieces. Gold and silver moved in both directions along the routes, but predominantly flowed eastward from Byzantine and Islamic territories to China. These precious metals took the form of coins, ingots, or worked objects like jewelry and decorative items. For merchants, gold and silver served not only as trade goods, but also as a form of portable wealth that could be used for large purchases when local currencies were not accepted. From the Siberian regions came furs, sable, fox, mink, and squirrel, luxurious and practical in cold climates. From the Mediterranean came coral, amber, and ivory. From India came cotton textiles, spices, and precious stones. From the steppes came horses, particularly the coveted heavenly horses of Fergana with their strength, speed, and endurance. Spices deserve special attention for their outsized importance relative to their physical volume. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and many others traveled from Southeast Asia and India through the southern branches of the Silk Road or via maritime routes that connected with the overland paths. These spices served not only as flavorings, but also as preservatives, medicines, and luxury goods, signifying wealth and sophistication. The trade in aromatics was similarly valuable. Frankincense and myrrh from the Arabian Peninsula, musk from the Himalayan regions, and various floral essences were transported in small, precious quantities. These scents were used in religious ceremonies, as personal perfumes, and as ingredients in medicines across cultures. Less tangible, but equally valuable, were the agricultural products and knowledge that spread along the Silk Road. Fruits like peaches and apricots traveled westward from China, while grapes and pomegranates moved eastward. Crops like cotton expanded their growing regions as cultivation techniques spread along the trade routes. The result was a gradual diversification of diets and agricultural practices across Eurasia. Medical knowledge and materials constituted another vital category of exchange. Chinese herbal medicine, Ayurvedic treatments from India, and Greco-Roman medical theories all traveled along the Silk Road, carried by physicians, religious figures, and merchants with an interest in healing. Medicinal herbs, minerals, and animal products were traded as physical goods, while medical texts were copied, translated, and shared among practitioners from different traditions. The movement of these goods was rarely direct. A bolt of silk produced in Chengdu might change hands dozens of times before reaching a buyer in Alexandria. At each exchange, its price increased as merchants added their profit margins and costs. By the time a Roman noblewoman draped herself in Chinese silk, the fabric might cost hundreds of times its original value. A markup that reflected not just profit-seeking, but the genuine costs and risks of long-distance transport. The mechanics of these exchanges varied by region and era. In some areas, barter was common, silk for horses, spices for porcelain. In others, transactions used standardized currencies, particularly Persian, Byzantine, or Chinese coins that were accepted across broad regions. Large-scale merchants developed sophisticated financial instruments, including letters of credit that allowed funds to be transferred between distant cities without physical movement of coins, an early precursor to modern banking. Perhaps most valuable of all the commodities that moved along the Silk Road was information. Technological innovations, scientific discoveries, religious ideas, artistic styles, and cultural practices all traveled alongside physical goods. The spread of papermaking from China westward revolutionized record-keeping and knowledge preservation. Mathematical concepts moved from India to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. Astronomical observations made in Baghdad informed calendar systems in China. The exchange of goods was never merely commercial. It was cultural, intellectual, and spiritual as well. Each object carried with it stories, techniques, beliefs, and values from its place of origin. A piece of blue and white porcelain brought not just a beautiful vessel, but also aesthetic principles from China. A manuscript carried not just information, but entire worldviews and intellectual traditions. For the people who lived along the Silk Road, not just the travelers, but the settled communities that served and traded with them. These goods represented connections to distant lands they might never see themselves. A farmer in a small oasis town might wear a cotton cap with patterns that originated in India, drink tea from China from a ceramic cup made in Persia, and season his food with spices from the distant islands of Southeast Asia, all while never traveling more than a few days' journey from his birthplace. As we consider these ancient treasures moving slowly across mountains, deserts, and steppes, we might reflect on how they connected people separated by vast distances. Each object that completed the journey from one end of the Silk Road to the other had been touched by dozens, perhaps hundreds of hands, craftspeople, merchants, animal handlers, guards, inspectors, middlemen. Each exchange was not just economic, but human, an interaction, however brief, between individuals with different languages, beliefs, and experiences. In this way, the goods of the Silk Road became more than mere commodities. They were embodiments of human connection, tangible evidence that even in a world without electronic communication or rapid transport, people found ways to reach across distances, to share the fruits of their creativity and labor, to learn from one another, and to build networks of mutual benefit and understanding. The romance of the Silk Road, with its exotic goods and cultural exchanges, can sometimes overshadow the very real hardships faced by those who traveled its length. Let us consider these challenges not with dramatic emphasis, but with quiet appreciation for the human persistence they reveal. The physical landscape presented the most immediate obstacles. The Silk Road traversed some of Eurasia's most formidable terrain: the shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert, the towering peaks of the Pamir and Tian Shan Mountains, the windswept grasslands of the Central Asian steppes, and numerous river crossings that could be peaceful streams in dry seasons but raging torrents after rains. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name is sometimes translated as the place from which there is no return, presented particularly daunting challenges. Stretching over 600 miles from east to west and nearly 300 miles from north to south, this vast basin of sand, dunes, and gravel offered almost no water or vegetation in its interior. Travelers were forced to skirt its edges, following oasis towns that formed a lifeline around its perimeter. Mountain crossings required careful timing. Passes like the Toragart between modern Kyrgyzstan and China, which rises to over 12,000 feet, were only passable during summer months. Even then, sudden snowstorms could trap travelers, and the thin air at high altitudes caused breathing difficulties for both humans and animals. Landslides and rock falls presented constant dangers on narrow mountain paths, where a single misstep could be fatal. Water management was a constant preoccupation. In desert regions, travelers needed to carry sufficient water for themselves and their animals between known sources, calculating carefully based on the season, the size of their caravan, and reports about conditions ahead. Too little water meant suffering from thirst or even death. Too much meant unnecessary weight burdening the animals. Experienced caravan leaders knew the location of every well, spring, and stream along their route, including backup sources for times when primary water points failed. The physical toll on human bodies was considerable. Travelers endured extremes of temperature, from the freezing winds of mountain passes to the scorching heat of desert days. The constant motion of riding animals caused back pain, saddle sores, and joint problems. Dust irritated eyes and lungs, while the glare of sun on sand or snow could cause temporary or even permanent vision problems. Diet was often monotonous and nutritionally limited during long stretches between settlements. Travelers carried dried fruits, nuts, hardtack bread, dried meat, and grains that could be quickly prepared at campsites. Fresh vegetables and fruits were rare treats found only when passing through agricultural regions. Vitamin deficiencies and digestive ailments were common, especially on journeys lasting many months. Disease was a constant companion on the Silk Road. Travelers encountered unfamiliar pathogens as they moved through different regions, often lacking immunity to local illnesses. Crowded caravanserais could become sites of contagion where infections spread rapidly. The most dramatic example was the spread of the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which likely traveled along Silk Road routes in the 14th century, carried by fleas-on rodents that infested caravans and ships. Less catastrophic, but more common were everyday ailments: respiratory infections from dust and weather changes, intestinal disorders from contaminated water or food, and skin conditions exacerbated by limited opportunities for bathing and changing clothes. Merchants typically carried basic medicinal supplies and developed practical knowledge of treatments, but serious illness far from home often proved fatal. Political boundaries created their own obstacles. The Silk Road passed through dozens of kingdoms, empires, and tribal territories, each with its own regulations, taxes, and attitudes toward foreign merchants. Travelers needed to be familiar with local laws and customs to avoid giving offense or falling afoul of authorities. They carried various forms of documentation: passports, letters of introduction, or official seals that granted permission to enter territories or conduct trade. Taxation was a significant consideration for merchants calculating their potential profits. Goods might be taxed multiple times as they crossed political boundaries or entered major trading cities. These taxes took various forms: fixed amounts per animal or cart, percentage-based duties on the value of goods, or requirements to sell certain items to local rulers at set prices before being permitted to trade in open markets. Some regions developed sophisticated customs systems. The Tang Dynasty of China established official frontier markets where foreign merchants were required to register, have their goods inspected and taxed, and obtain proper documentation before proceeding to interior cities. The Byzantine Empire and various Islamic caliphates had similar systems, with designated entry points for foreign trade caravans. Language barriers presented ongoing challenges. Major trading cities like Samarkand, Chang'an, or Baghdad were multilingual environments where merchants might converse in several tongues or employ interpreters. But in remote regions, communication often relied on gesture, simple trade vocabulary, or intermediaries who could bridge particular language pairs. Misunderstandings were common and could lead to commercial disputes or even dangerous conflicts. Cultural differences required careful navigation. Religious practices, gender norms, dietary restrictions, and concepts of appropriate behavior varied widely across the Silk Road regions. Successful merchants developed cultural intelligence, the ability to observe and adapt to local customs without giving offense. They learned when to remove footwear before entering a space, how to properly greet individuals of different status, which hand to use for eating or transactions, and countless other subtle details that facilitated positive interactions. The accommodation of religious practices was particularly important. Muslim merchants needed to maintain prayer schedules and dietary restrictions while traveling through Buddhist, Christian, or Zoroastrian regions. Buddhist pilgrims traversing Muslim territories required space and tolerance for their own devotions. The major caravanserais typically included prayer spaces that could be used by travelers of different faiths, a practical solution to the need for religious observance far from home. Personal security was never guaranteed. While the most successful periods of Silk Road trade occurred during times of relative political stability, banditry remained a persistent threat, particularly in remote mountain or desert regions where central authority was weak. Caravans developed various strategies in response, traveling in larger groups for safety, hiring armed guards, paying for protection from local tribes, or carrying minimal valuables on their persons. Perhaps the most fundamental challenge was uncertainty. A merchant setting out from Chang'an towards Samarkand might have reports about conditions from travelers moving in the opposite direction, but this information could be weeks or months old. Political situations changed, whether patterns shifted, water sources failed, or new dangers emerged, all beyond the knowledge of those beginning a journey. This uncertainty required both careful preparation and mental flexibility, a willingness to adapt plans based on conditions encountered along the way. The psychological dimensions of Silk Road travel are harder to reconstruct from historical sources, but no less significant. Travelers endured long separations from family and community, sometimes extending for years. They navigated the tension between curiosity about new experiences and longing for the familiar. They balanced the exciting potential for profit against the ever-present risk of catastrophic loss, of goods, animals, health, or life itself. Despite these manifold challenges, or perhaps because of them, the Silk Road developed a distinctive cultural ethos. Successful long-distance merchants were characterized not by reckless adventurism, but by careful calculation, cultural adaptability, and a patience to accept that a journey of thousands of miles would include many unexpected detours and delays. This same patience served them well in commercial negotiations, where hasty decisions could lead to significant losses. The best merchants knew when to wait for better prices, when to accept reasonable offers, when to press for advantage, and when to prioritize relationship building over immediate profit. They understood that reputation traveled along the same routes as goods, and that trustworthiness was perhaps their most valuable asset. As we reflect on these challenges from our comfortable present, we might appreciate not just the physical hardships endured, but the particular mindset required. One that accepted uncertainty as inevitable, that valued flexibility over rigid planning, that recognized the importance of cooperation in hostile environments, and that measured success not in days or weeks, but in the longer rhythms of seasons and years. While the material goods that moved along the Silk Road were valuable, the exchange of ideas, beliefs, technologies, and artistic styles was perhaps even more significant. These intangible transfers left an enduring legacy that continued to shape Eurasian cultures long after the trade routes themselves declined. Let us explore this cultural exchange with the same gentle attention we might give to examining a finely woven tapestry, appreciating both the individual threads and the larger pattern they create. Religious ideas traveled the Silk Road with particular fluidity, carried by dedicated missionaries, ordinary believers, and merchants who adopted new faiths during their journeys. Buddhism spread from its origins in India northward into Central Asia and eastward to China, Korea, and Japan, largely along trade routes. Merchants from the oasis cities of the Darien Basin were among the earliest converts, and they established monasteries that served both as religious centers and as safe stopping places for travelers. Buddhist monks became some of the most well-documented travelers on the Silk Road. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, 602 to 664 CE, made a famous 17-year journey to India to collect original Buddhist texts, returning with hundreds of manuscripts that he spent the remainder of his life translating. His detailed account of his travels, Great Tang Records on the Western Regions, provides one of our most valuable sources of information about the 7th century Silk Road. Christianity in its Nestorian form spread eastward along the Silk Road beginning in the 5th century CE. Nestorian communities established churches in major trading cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, and eventually Chang'an. The famous Nestorian stele, erected in Chang'an in 781 CE, documents the arrival of Nestorian Christianity in China and its acceptance by the Tang Emperor. Written in both Chinese and Syriac, it stands as a tangible example of cultural synthesis. Manichaeism, a faith founded by the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, spread both east and west from Persia along trade routes. Combining elements of Zoroastrian, Buddhist, and Christian belief, it was particularly successful among merchant communities who encountered diverse religious traditions in their travels and appreciated Mani's syncretic approach. Islam arrived in Central Asia and China via the Silk Road, following the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Muslim merchants established communities in major trading cities, gradually converting local populations. By the 10th century, the Turkic peoples of Central Asia had largely adopted Islam, transforming the cultural landscape of regions that had previously been predominantly Buddhist. These religious exchanges were rarely simple replacements of one faith with another. Instead, they produced fascinating syncretic practices and artistic expressions. In the Dunhuang cave temples, Buddhist paintings show influences from Zoroastrian, Nestorian Christian, and Manichaean iconography. Central Asian Muslims incorporated pre-Islamic festivals and customs into their practice. Christianity in China adapted its terminology and some concepts to be more comprehensible within Chinese philosophical frameworks. Languages and writing systems also evolved through Silk Road interactions. The Sogdian language, spoken by merchant communities from the region around Samarkand, became a lingua franca for trade across Central Asia during the 4th to 8th centuries. Sogdian script, derived from Aramaic, influenced the development of later writing systems, including Old Uyghur and Mongolian. Literary forms and narratives traveled alongside religions and languages. Indian fables and folklore spread westward and eastward, often adapted to local contexts while maintaining their core elements. The collection known as Panchatantra in Sanskrit became Kalila and Dimna in Arabic, eventually influencing European collections like Aesop's Fables. Similarly, Persian epic poetry found audiences in Central Asia and India, where it inspired local literary traditions. Scientific and medical knowledge flowed in multiple directions along the Silk Road. Indian mathematical concepts, including the decimal system and the zero, traveled to both China and the Islamic world, later reaching Europe. Chinese innovations in astronomy, including methods for predicting eclipses, influenced Islamic astronomical traditions. Greek medical theories preserved and developed by Persian physicians made their way to China, while Chinese herbal knowledge traveled westward. The exchange of agricultural products and techniques had profound and lasting impacts on daily life across Eurasia. Crops like cotton, initially domesticated in India, spread to China and westward to the Mediterranean. Fruits including peaches, apricots, and oranges traveled from their original growing regions to new lands where they became dietary staples. Irrigation technologies developed in arid regions transferred to similar environments thousands of miles away. Artistic styles and techniques flowed along the same routes as tangible goods. The distinctive blue pigment made from cobalt moved from Persia to China, where it transformed porcelain decoration, creating the renowned blue and white wares that would later become among China's most famous exports. Buddhist sculpture in China shows clear Greco-Roman influences that arrived via Gandharan art from what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. Persian textile patterns appeared in Chinese silks, while Chinese motifs like dragons and phoenixes were incorporated into carpets produced in Central Asia. Musical instruments and musical styles similarly traveled and evolved. The short-necked lute moved from Central Asia to China, becoming the pipa, while also traveling westward to become the European lute. The hammered dulcimer journeyed from ancient Persia throughout Asia and Europe, taking different forms but maintaining its basic structure. Pentatonic scales from China influenced Central Asian musical traditions, while rhythmic patterns from India were adopted and adapted by musicians further west. Architectural knowledge and aesthetics transferred across cultural boundaries. The dome and arch technologies from Byzantine and Persian traditions spread eastward, influencing sacred architecture in Central Asia. Chinese techniques for building would found applications in regions where timber construction had been less developed. Decorative elements, like muqarnas, honeycomb vaulting, in Islamic architecture, traveled along trade routes, evolving in each new region. Even culinary traditions were shaped by Silk Road exchanges. The movement of spices created new flavor profiles in regional cuisines. Noodles, likely originating in China, became staples in Central Asian and later Mediterranean cooking. Tea culture spread from China westward, adapting to local preferences and customs in each new region. Methods of preserving fruits and meat transferred between cultures facing similar challenges of food storage. Perhaps the most profound cultural exchange was the gradually evolving worldview of those who participated in Silk Road trade and travel. Merchants who spent decades moving between different cultural spheres developed a cosmopolitan outlook rare for their time. They learned to navigate multiple religious environments, political systems, languages, and social customs. They observed how different societies solved similar problems and came to appreciate diverse approaches to human challenges. This cosmopolitanism is reflected in the personal names and documents preserved from Silk Road communities. We find individuals with Persian names writing in Sogdian script about Buddhist concepts, Central Asian merchants with Chinese wives maintaining correspondence with relatives in distant cities, and multilingual legal documents that blend terminology and concept from different legal traditions to resolve commercial disputes. The oasis cities of the Darim Basin, places like Khotan, Kutcha, and Turfan, exemplified this cultural hybridity. These communities maintained their distinctive local identities while absorbing influences from all directions. A visitor to Turfan in the 8th century might encounter Buddhist monks from China, Manichaean priests from Persia, and Muslim merchants from Samarkand, all moving through streets where multiple languages were spoken and diverse religious buildings stood within sight of one another. This is not to suggest that the Silk Road was free from cultural conflict or prejudice. Sources record many instances of misunderstanding, distrust, and hostility between different groups. Religious persecution occurred in various regions and periods. Economic competition sometimes fueled ethnic tensions. Yet the practical necessities of long-distance trade created powerful incentives for peaceful coexistence and cultural accommodation, particularly in the major trading cities and caravanserais where diverse travelers gathered. The cultural legacy of the Silk Road reminds us that civilizations rarely develop in isolation. The great achievements in art, science, literature, and philosophy that we associate with particular cultures often emerge through processes of exchange, adaptation, and synthesis. Ideas and techniques moved across political and linguistic boundaries, being refined and transformed at each step of their journey. This pattern of cultural diffusion was not unique to the Silk Road, but the particular geography and history of these trade routes created especially fertile conditions for cross-cultural pollination. The diversity of environments and societies connected by the routes, the relatively decentralized nature of the trade networks, and the length of time over which these connections persisted all contributed to the richness of the resulting exchanges. As we drift towards sleep, we might reflect on how many aspects of our own daily lives, from the foods we eat to the stories we tell, from the technologies we use to the spiritual ideas we contemplate, have been shaped by similar processes of cultural exchange across time and space. The legacy of the Silk Road lives on not just in museums and historical texts, but in the tapestry of interconnected cultural elements that continue to evolve through ongoing human interaction. All great human endeavors eventually transform or fade, and the Silk Road was no exception. Its decline was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual shift, like a river changing course over centuries, seeking new channels while old ones slowly dry. Let us consider this transition and the lasting imprint left by these ancient pathways of exchange. Several factors contributed to the waning of the traditional Silk Road trade from the 15th century onward. Perhaps most significant was the rise of maritime trade routes connecting East Asia directly with the Middle East and Europe. The development of larger, more reliable ships and improved navigation techniques made sea travel increasingly attractive compared to the arduous overland journey. Portuguese explorers, followed by Dutch, English, and other European maritime powers, established direct sea routes to India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China. These voyages could transport much larger quantities of goods than camel caravans, and while they faced their own dangers, they avoided many of the political complexities of crossing multiple land borders. The cost of transportation dropped significantly, making Asian goods more affordable and widely available in European markets. Political changes across Central Asia also disrupted the traditional trade networks. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, which had maintained relative stability across much of the Silk Road during the 13th and 14th centuries, led to increased conflict and uncertainty for travelers. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the West and the Ming Dynasty in the East shifted political and economic priorities away from the Central Asian corridors. European colonial expansion further redirected global trade patterns. As European powers established direct control over production regions for spices, textiles, and other valuable commodities, they created new trade networks centered on their colonial interests rather than the ancient Eurasian exchanges. The discovery of the Americas also opened entirely new sources of goods and precious metals, further diminishing the relative importance of the traditional Silk Road. Changes in consumer preferences and manufacturing capabilities also played a role. As European countries developed their own porcelain and silk industries, often with technology and knowledge originally transferred from Asia via the Silk Road, the demand for these goods from distant sources decreased. Similarly, as tea cultivation spread to new regions, the trade in Chinese tea specifically became less essential. The Silk Road did not disappear overnight. Certain regional segments remained active long after others had declined. Local trade continued in many areas, even as the grand, continent-spanning exchanges diminished. Pilgrimage routes associated with various religious traditions followed many of the same pathways, maintaining connections even as commercial activity decreased. The legacy of the Silk Road, however, extended far beyond its active years. The cultural exchanges, technological transfers, and genetic mixing that occurred during its heyday had permanent effects on the societies it connected. Languages incorporated loan words from distant sources. Religions that had spread along trade routes became deeply rooted in new regions. Artistic traditions continued to reflect influences from faraway cultures, even as direct contact diminished. Even the physical landscape bears the imprint of these ancient exchanges. Agricultural products introduced via the Silk Road, like cotton, citrus fruits, and certain grains, transformed ecosystems and economies. Irrigation systems developed for these crops shaped water management practices that continue in some regions to the present day. The caravanserais and way stations, though often in ruins, remain as archaeological monuments to this vast network of human connection. Perhaps most enduring was the mental map of Eurasia created by these centuries of exchange. Even as direct trade declined, the awareness of distant civilizations and the possibilities of connection remained in cultural memory. Stories, place names, and historical references preserve knowledge of these routes and relationships, influencing how later generations understood their place in the broader world. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, European and Japanese imperial ambitions brought renewed attention to Central Asia, though now as an arena for geopolitical competition rather than cultural exchange. The Great Game between British and Russian interests, and later the contest between Soviet and Chinese influence, overlaid new patterns of power onto these ancient landscapes. The 20th century brought profound changes to the regions once traversed by the Silk Road. National boundaries hardened, often cutting across traditional trade routes and cultural connections. Communist revolutions in Russia and China transformed societies that had been shaped by centuries of mercantile exchange. Modernization projects, from railways to highways, created new transportation networks that sometimes paralleled ancient routes but operated according to very different economic and political logics. Yet even through these transformations, echoes of the Silk Road's legacy persisted. In the post-Soviet era, Central Asian nations have increasingly embraced their Silk Road heritage as part of their national identities. China's recent Belt and Road Initiative explicitly invokes the historical Silk Road as both inspiration and justification for new infrastructure and economic connections across Eurasia. Tourism now brings a different kind of traveler to many Silk Road sites. Visitors from around the world explore the cave temples of Dunhuang, the ancient city of Samarkand, or the bazaars of Istanbul, seeking connection with this storied past. While these experiences differ dramatically from the original context of these places, they represent a continuing human desire to reach across cultural and geographic distances. Scholars, too, have found renewed interest in the Silk Road, not only as a historical phenomenon, but as a model for understanding processes of cross-cultural exchange more broadly. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new details about life along these routes, while digital technologies allow for unprecedented sharing of information about scattered artifacts, texts, and sites. As we rest here at the end of our journey, we might reflect on what the Silk Road can teach us about human connection across differences. For all its challenges and complexities, it demonstrated the profound human capacity for adaptation, curiosity, and peaceful exchange. Merchants, pilgrims, and travelers found ways to communicate across language barriers, to respect unfamiliar customs, to learn from different traditions, and to build networks of trust that spanned thousands of miles. The Silk Road reminds us that borders, geographical, cultural, linguistic, or religious, have always been more permeable than they might appear. Ideas, technologies, arts, and beliefs have never remained neatly contained within their places of origin. They travel with people, adapt to new environments, blend with local traditions, and evolve in ways their originators could never have imagined. This ancient network also offers perspective on our contemporary moment of global connection. Today's digital exchanges of information and culture, our complex supply chains for goods and materials, and our multinational movements of people all have precedence in these earlier patterns of human interaction. The scale and speed have changed dramatically, but the fundamental human impulses to trade, to learn, to adapt, and to connect remain remarkably consistent. As you drift towards sleep, imagine for a moment that you are a traveler resting in a caravanserai under a vast Central Asian sky filled with stars. Around you are fellow travelers from distant lands, speaking languages you may not understand, but sharing the universal human experience of weariness at day's end and hope for the journey ahead. In this shared moment of quiet rest, separated by differences yet united by common needs, lies perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Silk Road, the recognition of our shared humanity across all distances and differences. Good night, fellow traveler. May your dreams be as rich and peaceful as the quieter moments along the ancient Silk Road, and may you awaken refreshed for whatever journey awaits you tomorrow.